For an entire generation, the Great Depression wasn't a chapter in a history book. It was their childhood. Imagine being 10 years old, standing in a doorway, watching your father quietly shatter. You don't just see him lose a job. You watch him lose everything. His certainty, his hope, his place in the world. That single, defining moment carved a psychological code into their subconscious. One that would run their whole lives. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What event wrote the code you're living by? That question has a very specific answer for the generation that was forged in the Great Depression. That single shared trauma carved a psychological code of Stoic pragmatism into them, an unconscious certainty that hardship is inevitable and that taking action is the only valid response. But that pattern isn't unique to them. What unfolded in their world has simply reappeared in a different costume. In yours? Honestly, every generation carries a hidden blueprint, a core code, etched by the major events they witnessed in their youth. In this video, we're going to decode those blueprints. We'll move through history, from the generation that fought World War II, to the one that grew up alone in their homes, to finally understand why you feel, and why we all feel, so profoundly different. Our journey starts with them, the ones who fought World War II. The generation born between 1901 and 1927. The people later named the Greatest Generation by journalist Tom Brokaw, who stepped back and actually chronicled their story. To understand their psychological code, their subconscious operating system, you have to see what forged it. Two of the most traumatic events of the 20th century, the Great Depression and World War II. For them, this wasn't something you skim in a history book. It was childhood. It was watching your father, once a proud man, lose everything. It was the gnawing uncertainty of where the next meal would come from. Then, as they came of age, it became the duty of fighting a global war, or the shared sacrifice of rationing at home. This relentless pressure, this constant proximity to ruin and loss, it writes a very specific code into your mind. That code is Stoic pragmatism. A deeply ingrained belief that hardship is simply an inevitable part of life, that complaining about it is pointless, a waste of the limited energy you have. The only thing that truly matters is what you do next. Action, responsibility, endurance. Many people today mistake this for being cold or unfeeling. That's a profound misunderstanding. You have to realize they came from a world where feelings were a luxury you couldn't afford. Feelings couldn't put food on the table. Feelings couldn't win a war. So you learned to bury them, to compartmentalize trauma. Not because you didn't feel it, but because you had to keep moving to survive. Honestly, it was less about emotional repression and more about triage. Their values crystallized into duty, honor, and personal responsibility above all else. They rebuilt a broken world, not by talking about how they felt, but by doing what needed to be done. But what happens when the world teaches you a different lesson? What happens when you learn, as a child, that the key to survival isn't to act, but to be quiet, to not make waves, to fade into the background and slowly to become invisible? That survival means becoming invisible. You get the silent generation. Born between 1928 and 1945, they were children of the Great Depression, witnesses to World War II. They saw the hardship, but they were too young to carry a rifle. Their defining trial wasn't a battlefield. It was a war of whispers. Their real test came during the McCarthy era, the Red Scare, a time of deep, suffocating paranoia. Imagine, for a second, you're a child in that world, you know? One day, your favorite teacher is suddenly gone, fired because of a book they once read. So what could possibly shatter such a deeply entrenched paradigm? The answer didn't come from a rebellion within the home. It came from the outside, arriving as a cultural shockwave that would force an entire generation to confront the very feelings they were taught to ignore. That shockwave had a name: the baby boomers. They were raised inside the unprecedented stability their parents had built, and under that roof, their fundamental psychological drive shifted. It wasn't about survival anymore. Honestly, it was about meaning. You know, they were the first generation to have the genuine luxury of asking not just how to live, but why. This new consciousness found its moment of psychic convergence in February 1964. 73 million people, the largest television audience in history at the time, gathered around their screens to watch the Beatles. It wasn't just a performance, it was a signal. An entire generation realizing, almost all at once, that they were not alone in their feelings, that they shared a new language and a different set of values. And then, the world they inherited cracked. The adult world, the world of order and stoic competence, proved to be fatally fragile. First, a president shot in Dallas. Then, a pastor murdered in Memphis. Then, another Kennedy, another Hope, extinguished in Los Angeles. For an entire generation, these were not distant news events you could ignore. They were a series of devastating psychological blows that shattered the nation's core belief in order and safety. The competent, silent men who could fix any engine suddenly seemed powerless to fix a broken world. The social contract was void. This created a profound crisis in the parental psyche. A new logic began to take hold in the parental subconscious, a logic born of trauma. If the outside world is fundamentally chaotic and dangerous, if the adults in charge cannot protect you, then the only rational response is to turn inward, to build a sanctuary, a place of managed solitude where the harshness of reality could be held at bay. A new paradoxical definition of love started to form, in direct opposition to the old one. Love was no longer about preparing a child for a hard world. It was about protecting them from it. This gave birth to a second philosophy of love, one that stood in direct opposition to the first. In this new story, love's purpose is not to prepare you for a hard world, but to shield you from it. And the most famous and most misunderstood artifact of this philosophy is the participation trophy. Today, it's easy to sneer at it, honestly, as a symbol of entitlement, a plastic reward for merely existing. But if you want to understand its true origin, you have to look into the subconscious of the parents who created it. These were the boomer parents, raised under the cold, public glare of constant ranking. They remembered the sharp, private shame of coming in last. They remembered the long, lonely walk home after being picked second to last for the team. You know, you might remember your own version of that walk. The trophy was never meant to say, "You are a winner." It was a well-intentioned, almost desperate attempt to say, "You belong here, even if you are not the best." It was an empathetic shield against the pain of exclusion they knew so intimately. But protection, when it mutates into overprotection, has profound and paradoxical consequences. Because true, resilient confidence is not something that can be handed to you. It cannot be bestowed like an award. It has to be earned. It's built on a bedrock of evidence, an internal private ledger that records, "I tried, I failed, I learned, I improved, I finally succeeded." Without the struggle, the victory feels hollow. And modern psychology backs this up. Recent studies, including a 2225 synthesis of research in psychology today, show that overprotective parenting is directly linked to reduced resilience and lower self-confidence. You've heard of the boomers, and you know about Gen X. But this is the story of the millions caught in the middle. The name comes from the slang term, jonesing. A deep, persistent craving for something you can't have. And for this generation, born between 1954 and 1965, what they were jonesing for was the optimism and opportunity they were told was their birthright, a future that vanished just as they came of age. Honestly, think about it. Your first major political memory isn't a march on Washington. It's watching a president resign on television, in disgrace. The subconscious lesson hardwired into you isn't fight the system. It's don't trust the system. Then you enter adulthood. You're ready to start your life, buy a home, claim your small piece of the dream. But instead of a booming economy, you're met with gas lines from an oil embargo, stagflation that devalues your money, and when you finally go to the bank for a mortgage, they tell you the interest rate is 18%. 18. The dream wasn't just delayed. For many, it felt like a locked door. So they didn't become revolutionaries like the boomers before them. There was nothing left to protest for. They simply became resourceful. They are the generation that fell through the cracks of history and learned to build a life there anyway, without grand expectations. But as their story ends, another one begins. A generation shaped not by a dream that was taken away, but by an emptiness that was there from the start. A generation defined by the quiet solitude of an empty house. The original Latchkey kids with a house key on a string around their neck. That key around your neck. It was never just a piece of metal. It was a symbol, a quiet badge, a declaration that your childhood would not follow the old script. You didn't just learn independence. You inhaled it in the still echoing air of an empty house. While your parents were out, both of them working, trying to keep a foothold in a shaky economy, you were, by default, in charge. You learned to be your own guardian, your own entertainer, your own source of comfort in that solitude. There was a unique, unsupervised freedom in it, a world without digital tethers or constant notifications, but it came at a cost. It taught you, almost at a cellular level, to rely on one person above all others, yourself, and you needed that lesson, because you watched what happened to the people who relied on the old promises. You watched your parents, who believed in the job for life contract, get hit by the brutal recessions of the 80s and the corporate downsizing of the 90s. They gave their loyalty year after year, and in return, they got a pink slip and a cardboard box for their desk photos. The psychological imprint was clear, and it was permanent. Your subconscious filed it away with brutal efficiency. Loyalty to a system, to a company, is a one-way street. The only security that exists is the security you build for yourself through your own skills and your own pragmatism. Society would later label you a cynic, a slacker, the detached generation. But they misunderstood the code. This wasn't pessimism. It was pattern recognition. It was a clear-eyed dose of reality. You simply learned much earlier than most that no one was coming to save you. So you learned to save yourself, and you stopped pretending otherwise. And so the historical code is written. The greatest generation, forged into Stoic pragmatists by depression and war. The silent generation taught that conformity equals survival. The boomers, their idealism shattered, learning to constantly reinvent. Generation Jones, forever jonesing for a stability that was pulled away. And now, Generation X, the quiet realists, built for self-reliance. We have the blueprints. We see how each of these psychological operating systems was installed. But what happens when you run them all on the same machine? At the same time, what does it mean for you, living today, caught in the crossfire of these profoundly different, competing worldviews? It means you now possess a new way of seeing. You understand that from the Stoic pragmatism forged in the Great Depression to the fierce self-reliance of the Latchkey kid, these generational traits are not random personality quirks. They are the scars and the skills left behind by the great battles of history, inherited, not consciously chosen. This knowledge isn't meant to excuse every behavior or justify every wound. Its purpose is to replace raw judgment with profound empathy. It gives you a kind of cipher to decode the people in your life, your parents, your colleagues, and most importantly, yourself. So the next time you witness that friction between worldviews, remember what you are actually seeing. You are not observing a character flaw. You are observing a chapter of history, playing out in real time through the person in front of you. Let me know in the comments which piece of this history resonates most within your own code. And if this analysis provided you with a new lens, subscribe. Join me for more deep dives into the hidden forces that shape who we are.